I first became aware of this funny little tiny band called Placebo in early '96. I was writing for Melody Maker, now defunct Music Weekly. There was a real buzz about this band. You know, this was still the stage where they were putting out singles with limited releases on small indie labels, and you'd see them sort of like third on the bill, and then they'd be second on the bill to some sort of like big indie band at London Astoria or whatever. And they were a band that everyone was talking about. Music journalists were talking about them as well as fans, and one of the main talking points initially was people would see this tiny figure on stage with long hair and makeup and his high-pitched voice, and people were never sure, genuinely, if it was a boy or a girl, which is a bit of a sort of pop music cliche, you know, when your dad's watching Top of the Pops when you're a kid, is that a boy or a girl? But it was quite genuine. People, you know, who was a very sort of androgynous figure, and some people were sort of, you know, confused and taken aback and then angered when they realised they'd been confused by this figure.
The thing about Brian and his makeup is, I don't remember him being that over the top to begin with. I guess he might have been dabbling with a bit of foundation at the time, but he certainly wasn't standing in the middle of Camden in a dress. I think that sort of came after. I think he started the band and he played with his sort of, you know, being a bit androgynous and all that, but it was never really over the top. And I think after the first few records, when people said he sounded a bit, you know, a bit girly, that I think it sort of started manifesting itself after that. And then by the time they were doing Brixton Academy, yeah, he was a little more feminine than PJ Harvey, God bless her.
Come Home was released later the same year on the Deceptive label. This gave the band their first taste of tangible success. The success of both was in part due to the relentless touring throughout the year, with bands such as Ash, Whale and Bush.
During that period, we wanted to sign the band long term, but they were very hot at this stage, and a lot of other record labels, including majors, etc., were chasing them. And to be honest, we weren't really in a financial position to match those kind of offers. So between recording the single and the single coming out, they pretty much decided that they were going to go with Hot, which was an imprint on Virgin EMI. But the deal with us on the single was relatively straightforward. It was like, we'll do the single, if we make some money we'll split it with you, and but you will promote the single, won't you? It's like, yeah, of course we'll promote the single. They then signed the major deal, and Virgin EMI got them on the David Bowie tour of Europe at the same time that our single was coming out on Deceptive.
David Bowie picked Placebo personally as a band support on his Outside tour in '96 when Placebo weren't even signed. He'd somehow got hold of a demo of theirs, and he liked what he heard, and he chose them to support him on a tour when I think he was trying to re-establish himself as a cutting-edge artist after the whole Tin Machine affair.
We managed to get them a slot on, I think it was the White Room at the time, a program called the White Room. And of course, I then kind of said, hey, great, we've got this brilliant telly for you. And they were really up for doing it, but the logistics of doing it meant something ridiculous, like they had to come off stage in Germany with David Bowie, and we had to sort of get a private plane to fly them, and it just got all way too complicated.
And he was touring for David Bowie, what were fairly small, intimate venues. He chose Placebo to open for him. So I think to an extent, Placebo represented had the audience, or the potential for the audience then, because they were still unsigned, that Bowie wanted to reacclimatise himself with at the time.
So unfortunately, you know, from our point of view, it would have been a great way to launch the single, but it was impossible to pull off logistically. So I blame David Bowie, really.
It was on the way to rehearsals for the White Room in 1996 that tensions between Robert and Brian reached crisis point, and Robert was asked to leave the band. Brian and Stefan knew there was to be only one replacement, and Steve, now working as a forklift truck driver after Breed had split, was recruited.
Around the time of the first album, I don't think they remember this, but I went to the gig at Dingwalls when the single was doing really well, while Robert was in the band. And Brian very clearly was saying to me, what's Steve doing? How's it going? Will you please pass on a message? Will you please let him know? Because they'd sort of fallen out of contact, and it was me. Next time I saw Steve, I told him to give Brian a ring.
The original lineup that had gelled so effortlessly was now back in business. Steve had less than 2 weeks to learn the first album before touring 13 countries in 4 months.
There is a discernible difference between Robert and Steve because Robert, although he was a good drummer, you know, he's drumming away in the background, but he always, to me, made it. He seemed, you could tell when you saw him, I think, that he was doing it because it was his job. And on the album, when you listen, you can hear that Steve he's got a lot of rhythm. He's got a lot more sort of funk and soul influences.
That's his thing. Steve loves to lay down a groove. He's obsessed with this idea of a big funky groove. That's his whole thing. And I think they felt Robert didn't have that, or at least was a much more kind of technical, clinical player.
Placebo had have a really amazing drum sound, and that goes back to even when they had their first drummer on their first album with tracks like I Know. There's just a huge beat, and the drums aren't there just because drums are meant to be part of a band. They're there and they've got a voice, and this is what was lacking in so much music. A real personality to each element of the band.
Placebo were now on the fast road to fame, with the single Nancy Boy reaching number 4 in the charts in January 1997, and an appearance on Top of the Pops.
In the early days, Steve appears in the Nancy Boy video with a towel over his head or whatever it is. And no, his face is pixelated out. And he appeared on Top of the Pops with a cloth over his head, like Prince. And that was because he was still contractually obligated. He'd signed a deal with a band called Jaguar, and he'd actually left them to join Placebo in effect, and he'd signed for an awful lot of money. So while the men in suits behind the scenes were sorting out the cash and the payback, his face couldn't be used.
My favourite Placebo song, I think, and it's an obvious one, but I do still really love Nancy Boy. It may not be the fans' favourite, maybe because it is a bit obvious and it got them on Top of the Pops, and the thing to say about the Top of the Pops track is always, oh, you should have heard their earlier songs or the B-sides, they're much better. But the impact that seeing them do Nancy Boy had when they were on Top of the Pops was similar, I imagine, to seeing Mark Bolan or David Bowie.
The year ended on a high, with a finale gig at London's Brixton Academy, a particularly proud moment for the band, followed by the support slot on U2's Pop Mart tour. When Placebo emerged in 1995, they were the antidote to the majority, a thrilling noise amongst the tired Britpop parodies. At a time when British musical ingenuity was a dying talent, Placebo united the influences of Bowie, Susie and the Banshees, Bauhaus and Sonic Youth into a genesis which to this day remains ultimately Placebo's.
It was very much a lads together, casual wearing in football crowd supporting that loaded lads culture coming through. Placebo seemed an antidote to all that.
At the time, it was kind of like the glory days of Britpop, which is obviously a very sort of fortuitous time to be a guitar band, but they were making music, guitar music, which was very, very different to all the sort of main Britpop bands.
It was these influences, and of looking beyond Britain and the music of the Kinks, the Beatles and the Small Faces, that set Placebo apart from the crowd.
It was that dark music that was coming back again as something a bit more experimental, edgy, romantic, androgynous, sensual, all qualities of pop music that seemed to have vanished in the Britpop period. Placebo seemed to be coming back and bringing that back with them.
In '95, I mean, it were Deceptive was at that stage. We